Good afternoon. My name is Mary Pat, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about an exploration of research methods, or as I like to call it, a visit with the science fairy. Problematic internet use is on my mind today. It's not in the DSM-5, but it's popping up in the literature and in therapy rooms and in my living room. I think it's important to know if we've got evidence-based practices that will help us work with clients who are dealing with this. Research can provide the information needed to develop such practices, but it requires a lot of different kinds of research to get there. It starts with the rather obvious question of what is problematic internet use? How do we define it? And right off the bat, we are looking at an important distinction between quantitative and qualitative research. If we were grounded theory researchers, we might set about asking people how they experience their internet use and see what kinds of constructs they use to evaluate and express that experience. But we're taking the quantitative route. So we're going to dive right into the existing research and find out what's been said and done about problematic internet use so far. And that is what we'll do for the sake of this presentation. Problematic internet use, as I said, is not in the DSM-5. There's a bit about internet gaming disorder that's been added to Section 3 under Conditions for Further Study, or as I like to think of it, the wish list for the science fairy. So we'll take a look at this. The proposed criteria for internet gaming disorder include preoccupation with internet games, where internet gaming becomes the dominant activity in daily life, withdrawal symptoms when the internet gaming is taken away, tolerance or the need to spend increasing amounts of time engaged in internet games, the unsuccessful attempts to control the participation in internet games, loss of other interests in previous hobbies and entertainment as a result of and with the exception of the internet games, continued excessive use of the internet games despite knowledge of psychosocial problems, having deceived family members, therapists, or others regarding the amount of internet gaming, and the use of internet games to escape or relieve negative moods or emotions. If that looks like a definition of addiction, you're right. The criteria are based on research that's coming out of China, where they call internet gaming electronic heroin. The term internet addiction gets tossed around frequently in the media, and it was even the subject of a documentary at Sundance last year. But from a scholarly perspective, we don't see researchers and clinicians using the word addiction very much. For now, as far as the DSM-5 goes, it's internet gaming disorder. But there is a lot of discussion in the literature about problematic internet use and what the right definition for problematic internet use is going to be. I'll address that in a moment. For our purposes, I think we can basically use these same criteria to discuss it. Our DSM-5 authors acknowledge that internet use for things other than gaming can become problematic. Then they summon the science fairy with the words, future research on other excessive uses of the internet would need to follow these guidelines. Wouldn't it be great if the science fairy could just wave a magic wand and the research we need to answer our question would just appear? Many studies have already been conducted on problematic internet use and many articles written. It is getting attention all over the world. It's also being examined in a number of different populations. And its possible links to other conditions or issues are being studied. The impact on social, emotional, physical, relational, cognitive, financial, and academic aspects of the lives of individuals, families, and even nations is being examined. There are researchers looking at the neurobiological side of problematic internet use, and the approaches being used to treat this issue are being discussed in the literature as clinicians and researchers present their empirical findings from various case studies and treatment programs. There are also several assessment and screening tools being tested in the field. Some are based on the criteria we saw, others are more detailed or customized for other parameters. The research on these instruments is seeking to establish reliability, that is, do these instruments measure consistent results, and validity, do they actually measure what they're supposed to measure. There are even some writers taking a sort of philosophical approach, questioning whether the idea of problematic is even a valuable construct. Perhaps it is just the way of the future, or perhaps it is a valid coping tool for some people. Others are examining the ways in which website and game designers and programmers are maximizing for addictive effects, like the nicotine in cigarettes and the sugar in McDonald's burgers. The product is being knowingly manipulated to be too appealing to stop. This raises another important point about research, and that is ethics. The basics of research ethics are, of course, to do no harm, to ensure informed consent, to protect anonymity and confidentiality, to be honest about findings, and any potential conflict of interest. What about the researchers who are finding evidence that programmers and software designers are deliberately creating sites and programs that they know will be more addictive? It's worth considering whether they bear a responsibility to society to bring this information to the attention of those who regulate the public safety of consumers. This is discussed quite well in our textbook by Babby. Another interesting ethical question that has popped up in the research on problematic internet use is the practice of researchers entering the online environment as a gamer, forum, or social media participant for the purposes of gathering information. The people with whom they interact have no way of knowing that they are engaging with a researcher rather than just a fellow internet user, unless the researcher identifies themselves. The internet is new enough that standards for conducting this kind of research are still in the making, and there are lingering gray areas. There's a process one follows in designing a research project. It starts with research question. All the studies we've looked at a few minutes ago have played a role in the formulation of my research question. I've spent time examining the questions other researchers are asking. I've listened to the questions and concerns coming from my experience in clinical practice and other voices from our field. My problem is I have a hard time narrowing down my own question. I want my question to generate results that will inform clinical practice, that will help people in my field to help their clients. I have so many questions. I just want to know everything. But I don't want to anger the science fairy. So here's my workaround. I think I will be better able to formulate a focused question if I kind of skip to the next step, the sampling step. Sampling is about choosing the population you want to study. I'm going to try to narrow my question down by focusing on a particular population. So how about college kids? Oh, right, yeah, that would be unwieldy. Right. Let me think. Is there a sample within that population that will reflect an important need or concern? How about those who are experiencing mental health issues? That's a concern in our society. Colleges and universities are feeling overwhelmed by how many kids are turning up with mental health issues when they get to college. Parents are concerned too. Yeah. That's true. Lots of confidentiality and consent issues there. But hey, how about if we take a look at the students who come in for mental health assistance at university clinics? Maybe my research question can be, how many students who seek mental health treatment at their school counseling center or mental health clinic are also experiencing problematic internet use? Okay, so we have a research question now. Great. But we have more work to do on the sampling part. The point of sampling is to gather a portion of the population rather than everyone in order to collect data that will be generalizable to the broader population. Therefore, the sample has to be representative of the target population. In our study, we're focusing on students who are experiencing mental health difficulties of some kind, and we're drawing our sample from the counseling center clients. It's safe to say that as far as that clientele represents that population, our study will too. The next aspect of sampling that comes into play here is clustering or stratification in order to break down our sample to manageable size. We can't study every college kid in America, so we figured out a natural grouping that is smaller and more manageable. But we can't study every student who goes into the counseling center at their school either. So how many schools can I use, Science Fairy? I want to pick one in each biome because that might be a factor, and each region because that might be, and some that are public, and some that are private, and some that are Ivies, and some that are athletic powerhouses, and some, right. Okay, so there's a place for sensitivity to individuals and their specific situations, but it's not necessarily the best way to approach research. The whole point of sampling is that you avoid having to study everyone. Okay, that's a good idea. Let's start with designing the study for just one school. If we do a good job, other researchers might be inclined to replicate our study at their schools, and we'll all benefit from even more data. I'll bet the Science Fairy hears from panicked PhD candidates looking for good topics all the time. Okay, I'll try to keep this simple. I need a school that has an on-campus clinic. I want one that has a diverse enough population that our data will be interesting and generalizable. Aha! So here's our school. I think I've heard of it in U.S. News and World Report, haven't you? Make Believe Polytech University. Yeah, that rings a bell. So here's what our clusters look like now. We've honed in from all college kids to college kids seeking treatment to college kids seeking treatment at Make Believe Polytech. Oh, right. Well, maybe we should limit it by time, maybe a semester. But what if winter is worse for internet use than spring? Or what if football season or graduation season is a factor? How about this? How about Make Believe Polytechnic University students seeking treatment during the 2015-16 academic year? We could administer a problematic internet use screening instrument by slipping it into the stack of other screening and assessment instruments those clinics administer to every student who walks in the door. I have a bad feeling about this. The Science Fairy knows my weaknesses. I was really hoping that cluster sampling would spare me from this. In sampling, a researcher often has to use statistical techniques to ensure that the sample can be shown to have a high probability of representing the broader population to which the researcher wants to apply the results. It's a rather mathy process, and I'm not a big fan. But it's often an important aspect of selecting a good sample. You have to be able to show that you've accounted for sample bias and sampling error, and the Science Fairy is rarely any help with this part of the project. The numbers and calculations must be dealt with. Okay, I knew something was coming. This is it, our glass slipper. I guess we can only process data for 200 students. So if we get more than that, and I really want data from the entire year, I will have to do some probability sampling to select the 200 who best represent the whole population of Make Believe Polytech students who come into the counseling center. I could just do a randomizing technique, like blindly pick every nth student until I've got 200, or I could research the clinic's demographic information and numbers and come up with a system for selecting the right students for our study by gathering the appropriate percentages of ages, grades, majors, genders, whatever. We'll see what happens when the data comes rolling in. So here's what our cluster sampling looks like now. We'll be looking at 200 or fewer of the students who come into the counseling clinic at Make Believe Polytech U in the academic year 2015 to 16. Research question, check. Sample, check. Next is data collection. Let's talk for a minute about data collection strategies. Data collection can be done via experimentation, where you set up conditions and controls and all of that and collect your data for analysis. It can be observation or fieldwork, where you gather data in its natural habitat, as it were. The qualitative folks like that one a lot. It can be gathered by analyzing existing research or historical data. And it can be gathered, as it will be in our study, via surveys. Surveys allow for a quick collection of information, often self-reported by the participants. The instrument must be carefully constructed to avoid confusing wording, and it has to be tested for reliability and validity. Does it produce consistent results? Does it actually measure what it's supposed to measure? To keep things simple, I decided to use an existing instrument to assess problematic internet use. Creating one from scratch where there are existing measures that have been tested and analyzed is redundant. Using an existing measure and adding our findings to the growing body of empirical data that's being generated by the research community is going to be of greater use to clinical practitioners than adding a new measure to the mix whose data may or may not correspond or be relevant to the existing data. The Compulsive Internet Use Scale was developed back in 2009 to address the same categories that appear in the DSM regarding behavioral addictions like gambling. It uses a 14-question questionnaire with Likert scale. It uses a 14-question questionnaire with Likert scale responses to gather self-report data regarding internet use. Oh, you're welcome. Any chance I can get out of that slipper clause? Well, it was worth a shot. The Compulsive Internet Use Scale has been tested by a number of researchers on various populations over the years. It has been tested up against other instruments as well and has been shown to have good internal consistency, reliability, and validity. Here's a chart from the first studies that were done by the scale's creators. Check out those great fit indices and Kronberg calculations and all of those good things. God bless the statisticians. If we take a closer look, you can see that the questions are carefully constructed to be clear, easy to understand, short, and simple enough to avoid confusion. They don't contain biased items or terms, and they are sequenced in such a way that they don't interfere with each other. This instrument is easily administered and, as I said, has been validated in countries and languages around the world. So, how are we going to use it? As I mentioned above, in our hypothetical study, we'd ask the mental health clinic on campus to slip it into their stack of papers each student is given to fill out on their first visit. And we'd also request a little demographic info on the respondents as well, so we could identify the population we end up with, beyond just the fact that they are college students coming into the clinic. It would be necessary to secure permission from the appropriate research ethics boards, of course. Their requirements would dictate the approach we'd need to take in terms of informed consent. Fortunately for this imaginary study, the Science Fairy has arranged for us to work with a university that is conducting ongoing research at its mental health clinic and has an established protocol for informing students and inquiring their consent. They'll even take care of training their staff regarding the administration of the survey, and they've offered the help of some of their grad students and interns to help with scoring them too. Make-believe Polytech is a wonderful place to do research. Wow, time flies. Our data has come in. Let's take a look at what we found. It so happens that the clinic we worked with is conducting numerous studies, some of which are quantitative, measuring parameters that can be expressed numerically, such as what percentage of the student body comes into the clinic in a given year, or how many freshmen come in each year, or do more male or female students come in. They are also conducting qualitative studies, measuring parameters that are not easily reduced to numbers, as Babby says. These might include things like students' feedback on their experiences in the group therapy sessions, or the differences in the language male students and female students use to describe their symptoms of anxiety. Our study was a quantitative study. It measures how many of the students in our sample experience problematic internet use. That's just one variable, so we can use simple univariate analysis to examine and report our findings. Univariate analysis is mostly just descriptive. It includes things like distribution and central tendency, mode, mean, and average, and standard deviation. The first thing we'll look at is the frequency distribution for our parameter, problematic internet use. This is what our study sought to determine: how many of the students who come into the on-campus mental health clinic are experiencing problematic internet use. And we have achieved that. Our data show that 72% of the students in our sample from one school year at Make-Believe Polytech University experience problematic internet use. It looks like these results may well be generalizable to apply to broader populations, such as college students seeking mental health care at other schools. Thanks to our good fortune, there were 180 respondents to our survey, which kept us below the glass slipper line of 200, so we didn't have to do any probability sampling for our target population. Oh, right. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Our research indicates that it would be advisable for campus mental health clinics to screen for problematic internet use. We've generated some empirical evidence that can help guide clinical practices in our make-believe universe. Now, let's say that thanks to the science fairy, we were able to get some nice additional data to conduct our analysis, so we can see the frequency distributions across other characteristics of our sample, like their age or their identified gender, whether they're freshmen, sophomore, juniors, or seniors, what major they're in, whether they live on or off campus, what presenting complaint brought them into the clinic, and maybe even ethnicity. This bonus data will give us the opportunity to do some additional bivariate and multivariate analyses. This kind of analysis can go beyond simple description and begin to help us find explanations. Here's what it might look like. Here's one of the tables we got from our data. It shows the breakdown by class, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. We can see how many of each class came in to the counseling center, and then what percentage of the sample each class represented. So the sophomores were 23.9 of our total sample. Seniors were 30.6 of our total sample. Then we can also take a look at how many individuals from each of these groups was experiencing problematic internet use. For example, here's 29 of the freshmen were having this issue. 3 of them were not. And over here we see the percentage of our freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors who have problematic internet use. Some of that same information can be conveyed via a bar chart. Here's the depiction of those percentages of freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors who were experiencing problematic internet use. You can see that a high percentage of our freshmen and sophomores coming in were dealing with it, and then it drops off when they hit junior and senior year. We can't necessarily explain why yet, but we can notice that trend, and it can inspire further research. The next table shows how problematic internet use and gender were related. The clinic's data form allows for 3 options for gender: identify as male, identify as female, and do not identify as either of these. This table shows that 56.1% of our sample identifies as male, and of those, 77.2% experience problematic internet use. Those who identify as female made up 41.7% of our sample, and 66.7% of these have problematic internet use. 2.2% of our sample are individuals who do not identify as either male or female, and of these, 50% reported problematic internet use symptoms. Because this third grouping is so small, there is likely to be a large sampling error there. We can't generalize for the greater population on this particular parameter. Here's another pie chart. This one reflects the gender distribution among those students who were experiencing problematic internet use. We can see that it's pretty close to the distribution among the sample as a whole. This table shows the number of students from these majors who sought help at the counseling center, what percentage of the whole sample each major represents, and then how many of each fell into the group that identified with problematic internet use, and then the percentage per major for problematic internet use. Here's another pie chart, and this one shows the distribution of the majors in the problematic internet use sample. This pie chart is fairly useless. I mean, what kind of pie has slices that are all around the same percentage, about 70% of some mysterious quantity? This pie chart is here to remind us that pretty graphs and charts do not good data analysis make. Now, here's a bar graph that does a much better job of showing us the problematic internet use distribution by major. Some of these groups are sort of small. For instance, there were only 14 math majors represented, so there may be a bit of sampling error that would impact our ability to generalize these results for the math majors as a whole. This bar graph does even more for us. It presents a comparison of the distribution of the majors within the sample here, and you can see that potential sampling error quite clearly now where the math is, because we see the ratio between the math majors in the sample and the math majors with problematic internet use. It looks kind of high right there because there's not much of a gap, but there's not much to work with. Over here where we had more information, there were more business majors, there were more social science majors, more humanities majors, we can probably rely on those ratios a little bit more than the ones in the smaller groups. Next, we have another bar chart. This one demonstrates our findings regarding problematic internet use and housing arrangements. The overall sample was fairly well balanced between on-campus and off-campus students, but the problematic internet use group was not. The off-campus students were more highly represented in that small group. This table has some interesting information. It shows us the number of students who came in with each of these complaints, and then it tells us how many of them were also experiencing problematic internet use. You can see that the percentage of the whole sample, that is all the kids who came in who complained of, say, depression, anxiety, ADD, etc., is right here. This is data that clinic likes to have, no doubt. What we like about it is it seems to point to some important information for clinicians, or it doesn't. Here's a bar chart comparing the distribution of the presenting complaints in the overall sample and the problematic internet use distribution in these subgroupings. It shows us that we will need to be careful in drawing any conclusions about some of the correlations because of our sample sizes, especially these little ones here and here. But what does all of this really tell us? We can say for this sample, which represents students who seek mental health assistance, we see some possible correlations, say, between being male and experiencing problematic internet use or living off campus. With more fancy software than the Microsoft Excel I just used to make these pies and bars, one could do some additional subgroup comparison. What about males who also live off campus and who are also sophomores? These multivariate analyses may uncover additional correlations that could inspire further study or indicate possible risk or protective factors for problematic internet use. Whatever correlations we might find through the additional analysis, they will not be causalities. That's important to remember so we don't anger the science fairy. To prove causality, experiments must be designed with that purpose in mind, and ours was only an exploratory descriptive survey. Let's say the science fairy was also able to get some qualitative data on our population. Say the counselors at the clinic asked each participant to talk about the internet sites they use most often and why. What would we do with this qualitative data? How would we analyze it? Qualitative analysis is usually looking for patterns and meanings in the data. To make use of the data gathered by the Make-Believe Polytech University counseling staff, we would begin by coding it, classifying the responses in some way that organizes them for analysis. Open coding involves looking at the data and identifying the keywords and ideas that appear. For example, in our imaginary data set, we might have noticed that Facebook, Twitter, Imgur, Tumblr, and Pinterest appear quite often in the participants' response to this question. We might decide to group these together as social media in order to get a view of this broad pattern in our sample, perhaps to contrast it with gaming. Let's say we also see a lot of responses that involve avoiding something, avoiding a feeling of boredom or loneliness, avoiding homework or other stressors. We might decide to group these responses together as avoiding to track this pattern in our data. Axial coding refers to this process of grouping the data based on a pattern that has emerged during open coding. Selective coding evolved from axial coding as central themes emerge through multiple examinations of the data. When the analysis is complete, these central themes are explored further. Another important aspect of qualitative analysis is communication. Researchers must communicate with one another and with their own future selves by keeping excellent records of their coding paradigms and protocols. In the case of our study, we might take the grounded theory approach and examine the extant literature about problematic internet use, and find out if others have findings or theories related to the data we've extracted from our study. We might also take a look at our quantitative data and see if there are correlations with our qualitative and quantitative data. For example, was avoiding more highly correlated with respondents who seemed positive for problematic internet use? Did gaming or social media stand out more among those who experienced problematic use? So, to sum up, in our exploration of research methods today, we started with identifying our research question, looking at the literature about problematic internet use to guide us. We looked at our sampling options. Then we started that with the idea to study college students, and then we narrowed it down in clusters, naturally occurring groups. We focused on college students who are seeking treatment for mental health issues on the campus. Then we limit our sample frame to just one university, and finally to a group of 200 or less who came to the on-campus counseling center during one academic year at that school. Next, we set about gathering our data. Surveys were issued to students as part of their entry paperwork at the on-campus clinic. We used an existing instrument that has been well tested and has good reliability and validity. And we had trained staff to administer and score it. Then we used univariate and bivariate and multivariate analysis and generated tables and charts to convey our findings. As a result of our study at Make Believe Polytechnic University, they have decided to continue the study into the next academic year. The director has stated that they will begin offering continuing education opportunities to the staff to increase their knowledge of problematic internet use, its impact on clients' lives, and the treatment approaches that are showing promise. It is hoped that the treatment of presenting complaints will be enhanced by this additional evidence base for their practice. The Student Life Office has also decided to implement a program to raise awareness among student leaders, faculty, and the student body. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. A list of all the references for this presentation is included in your handout, as are all the charts and graphs. I'd be glad to entertain questions at this time.